Our hearing addresses an extremely critical topic this morning, the worsening crisis in the Central African Republic, where untold lives hang in the balance and the window for action is narrowing each and every day. This is not the first hearing that we've had on the Central African Republic. It follows up on a hearing that we held last November, and of course many of us, like our distinguished witnesses, have been in ongoing and numerous meetings with bishops, imams, humanitarian NGOs, diplomats, and interested parties. I would note that at our November hearing, Acting Assistant Secretary Robert Jackson, who will again testify today, stated that the CAR was in a pre-genocide stage. Since that time, that Mr. Jackson spoke to us, the situation appears to have gotten demonstrably worse. We will hear again today from Secretary Jackson, who will update us not only on the situation on the ground, but also on a change in policy that I believe reflects a course of action that we had recommended that the administration undertake last November, namely that the United Nations peacekeepers be introduced into the country, as the existing African force has been serving far too many vested interests. Hopefully such an intervention will not come too late, because we are witnessing a country that is in rapid disintegration, apparently descending again from a pre-genocide stage to one characterized by a word almost too painful to articulate: genocide. For in a country that for decades has been characterized by brutal misrule and brazen corruption, we are seeing for the first time sectarian divisions such as never existed before. Economic tensions and rivalry over land use for grazing versus planting has always existed, but it has given way to a butchery based on religious and ethnic affiliation. This is happening at a time when we mark the 20th anniversary of the genocide in Rwanda. When that country was being turned into a massive killing field, the world stood idly by. Both President Clinton and UN peacekeeping chief at the time, Kofi Annan, had actionable intelligence information that could have prevented or at least mitigated the Rwandan genocide, but chose callous indifference that enabled slaughter of unprecedented proportions. I would note parenthetically that I held a series of hearings, 3 of them, on Rwanda, and we heard from people who said we had the information in hand. General Dallaire was there on the ground willing to take effective action to curtail what turned out to be upwards of 1 million people who were slaughtered, and with that information, again, that could have been prevented or at least largely mitigated. When the blood stopped flowing, the world looked at the corpses piled high and was shocked. Never again was the phrase that was on everyone's lips. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it is happening again, as we know, as our distinguished witnesses know and will bear witness to today. The question before us today is whether the phrase never again is one that we simply use to pay lip service while nothing is being done or not enough, and whether or not we are going to act decisively. We do have 2 distinguished witnesses from State here today, and as I mentioned, Acting Secretary, Assistant Secretary Jackson, and also Ann Richard, Assistant Secretary for Population, Refugees, and Migration. While the State Department sending 2 people to testify is very encouraging, as it shows a heightened commitment to the issue, the question I will be asking them to answer is, what are we doing? Not what are we doing, but are we doing enough? In 2012, the administration, to much fanfare, created an Atrocities Prevention Board, following a presidential study directive which stated that, quote, preventing mass atrocities and genocide is a core national security interest and a core moral responsibility of the United States, close quote. The APB is supposed to provide early warning of mass atrocities and mobilize interagency resources to stop such atrocities. But where has the board been? Did we take our eyes off the ball in the CAR, perhaps because we are confronted by too many other crises? While we have taken some steps, including authorizing $170 million in humanitarian and peacekeeping aid, something we hope to hear more about from our government witnesses, are such resources adequate given the magnitude of the problem? We have a situation where in a country with a population of roughly 5.2 million people, 1.3 million are at risk of starvation, while 2.5 million are estimated in need of other forms of humanitarian assistance. That is nearly half the country. We are seeing ethnic cleansing, whereby whole villages are being emptied and a countryside laid waste. There are more than 600,000 internally displaced persons in the CAR, plus more than 320,000 others who are refugees in neighboring countries. Illustrative of how the situation has worsened, the total number of those displaced has doubled since the time we held our hearing last November, when it was estimated at 460,000 CAR nationals displaced. Accurate figures for the numbers killed are hard to come by, and we hope our witnesses will be able to find or to shed some light on that. We are told that an estimated 2,000 people have been killed since December alone, but I believe that number is probably a conservative estimate. What reports we do receive, however, are blood-curdling. Human Rights Watch reported on an attack of a Muslim neighborhood in the town of Guin in the early morning hours of February 1st by so-called anti-Balaka forces. A father recounted how, as the family was fleeing, he saw his 10-year-old boy shot in the leg and fall down. The child was then set upon by men with machetes who hacked at him until he was dead. 4 days later, in what was reminiscent of the massacre in Srebrenica in former Yugoslavia, anti-Balaka forces came upon a group of Muslims who were in hiding. They separated the men from the women and small children and executed the men, 45 of them, using machetes and then shooting those who lay wounded. Through the decades, the CAR has been beset by violence and misrule. Such religious-based violence, though, is something that is a new phenomenon. How did the country get to this point? What began as a political coup d'etat in March 2013 against former President Francois Bozize by Michel Djotoja quickly took on religious and ethnic overtones. As we detailed in our March hearing, the Djotoja came to power with the military backing of Seleka, a militia of some 25,000 men, up to 90% of whom came from Chad and Sudan, and therefore constituted a foreign invasion force in the eyes of many. They did not speak the local language and are Muslim in a nation that is over 80% Christian or otherwise non-Muslim. They destroyed churches, executed priests, stirred up sectarian hatreds where little to none had previously existed. What we began to see happening last November in response to Seleka was a reactionary backlash by anti-Balaka or anti-Machete self-defense gangs. Since then, retaliatory outrages committed by anti-Balaka forces have escalated, and Muslim civilians who had nothing to do with Seleka became targets. As in the case of Guin, whole neighborhoods in the capital city of Bangui and whole villages have been cleansed of their Muslim populations. As we will hear from our witnesses, there are numerous causes contributing to grievances, including a fight to control conflict minerals. Guin, for example, is a mining area, and thus there are economic motives at work there as well. Insofar as conflict can be described as religious on one level, it is also true religious fervor and dedication that provides the greatest hope for peace and reconciliation in the Central African Republic. Some of you will recall how a few months ago, 3 great religious leaders came to Washington as well as to New York, the United Nations especially, meeting with people on both sides of the aisle, both chambers, the White House, and UN officials. One was a Muslim imam, another evangelical Christian leader, and a third a Catholic bishop of Bangui, Imam Leama, Archbishop Zapalenga, and Nicholas Bangu. The 3 spoke, and I met with them, as did so many others, and was absolutely impressed, in awe of their fervor to bring peace and reconciliation to their country, and to do just like the Christians or Muslims are trying to do against the Boko Haram, where we saw recent outrages. And Greg Simpkins and I were in Jos recently, last September, and met with the imam there, as well as the Catholic Archbishop, who have joined arms and linked hand-to-hand their communities to say no to the extremism on either side. In that case, it's Boko Haram. We're seeing the same positive interreligious dialogue and cooperation occurring again here in CIR. Finally, I want to relate to you a story about another man of God, someone whom those of you who attended our November hearing will remember and remember well. 2 weeks ago was Holy Week. And Holy Thursday, Bishop Nungo, who testified at our hearing, was visiting an outlying parish along with 3 of his priests. The car he was traveling in was stopped on the road by Seleka gunmen, whose leader had for a period occupied his city, his parish. He accused Bishop Nungo of having thwarted his plans and working with international peacekeepers. He then sentenced him and the other 3 priests to execution and death. The gunman removed his episcopal ring and a large cross he had around his neck. And you might remember when he sat where you sat, Secretary Jackson, he wore that cross around his neck. The 4 men were placed in a truck and were then driven north to the border with Chad for the order to be carried out. On the way to the gallows, their truck was stopped, again by Salika gunmen, this time commanded by another warlord who actually knew Bishop Nungo and knew that he was a true humanitarian and a man of peace, and knew that the bishop provided for over 35,000 displaced people in his parish, whether they were parishioners or not. He just cared for them. He ordered the bishop and the priest freed, and through those efforts of international aid organizations and the peacekeepers, they were helicoptered back to his home parish in time for Good Friday. The story really hit home with me, and I'm sure it will with others who know him. Here's someone who I and others shared coffee with. We prayed with him, and then we heard him give powerful testimony. And his clarion call was to the international community to get those peacekeepers, besides all of the humanitarian aid and the other needs that he said was so desperately needed. He said, we need peacekeepers who will stop the carnage, and will do it immediately. So I'm grateful that he survived to continue doing his great life-saving and life-enhancing work, but it just underscores the precarious nature and how everyone, Muslim, Christian, are at risk. Clergy, imam, bishop, they're all at risk